All right, well, we're going to be in Genesis chapter 35, so if you have a Bible or some device wherein you can follow along with us, then I recommend that if you can. And we're going to read through not a ton, but a lot of good stuff today. We finished off last time in our Birth of a Nation series talking about Jacob and Isaac and Abraham and how God has brought all of these events, and we look pretty in-depth at a lot of these events, how all of these events have kind of brought things together. In fact, I was watching the Nativity. I know, so raise your hand if you've seen the Nativity. Make sure I'm okay. Well, not as many as I thought. You need to watch the Nativity. Okay, that's like the assignment for the day. It's a little bit late now that Christmas is over, but it's never too late. It's a great movie about the birth of Jesus. But in that movie, of course, they always take a little bit of license, but one of the thoughts on the wise men that came from the east is that they were following three different stars, and they aligned together from our perspective from on the earth to where they kind of formed one bright star, but they were actually three stars that came together. Now, whether or not that was the case, I cannot say, but it was at least interesting. And I think in a lot of ways, that's kind of how it was with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, that God kind of brought those things into alignment so that the nation of Israel would be born just in the way that it was. And so without rehashing that, I know that there's sometimes you listen to preachers and they spend like half the sermon reviewing like what they covered before, and you're like, dude, I was here, I heard it all, why are we doing it again? So I don't want to go into all that, but that's basically where we are if you're just joining us, or if you've been gone for a few weeks. And so we're going to move to chapter 35, and in this chapter, we've basically come to the place where we're going to lose some people. I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but Rachel is going to she's going to die, and Isaac is going to die. And even though we kind of thought he was going to die before, he ended up living a lot longer than he thought. Whenever the whole thing went down with Esau, and Esau is going to now move to another place, because just kind of like with Abraham and Lot, their herds were too big to coexist in the same spot. He's going to move off and form a new nation called Edom. And later you'll see that becomes significant. So the Edomites live near Canaan. And so that's really what happens in chapter 35. And so we'll kind of skip through that for time's sake and not read all of that. And after it talks about Rachel's death in verse 16, when you get to verse 21, it lists all the sons of Israel. Now, if you were with us on a few Sundays ago, I guess 3 Sundays ago, we actually underlined each of those as they were born. So if you want, though, a more concise listing where you don't have to work quite so hard, then you can see that there. It's good if you can kind of memorize all of the tribes. I think it's helpful, because all throughout a lot of the following books, especially like in Joshua and Judges and in Deuteronomy, and in Exodus too, you're going to see these people and tribes referred to a lot. And so if it's just a name, it may not bring the stars into alignment, so to speak. But if you kind of know the names, you're like, oh yeah, I remember that one and that one, then you'll start to see that God used each of these tribes in different ways, and each of these patriarchs in different ways. Now, one thing that I do want to draw attention to before we read about Isaac's death and go on to chapter 37, we're going to kind of skip over 36. Notice that it says Rachel's sons were Joseph and Benjamin. And if you recall, Benjamin is the youngest, and he's the little guy that's going to become the head of one of the priestly groups. There's the Levites and the Benjamites who are going to be given that responsibility. So I want to kind of review that, and if you're kind of learning this story for the first time, plant those things in your mind, because we're going to read about Joseph today and spend quite a bit of time talking about Joseph. And remember that him and Benjamin have kind of a special place in the next part of this story. And note that they were, of course, Rachel's, who's now has died. And so in verse 27 it says, Jacob came to his father Isaac at Mamre in Kirath Arba, which is in Hebron, where Abraham and Isaac had stayed. And Isaac lived 180 years, and he took his last breath, and he died, and was gathered to his people, old and full of days, and his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. And so even at that point, I mean, obviously, Jacob and Esau had some kind of relationship, even though it probably wasn't, the most non-adversarial ever. They came together, but really that was also kind of the catalyst for them to split. And so now Esau is going to move and take I think it's the Seir or Sine Mountains. I'm trying to remember what it was called exactly, but he's going to move up in the mountains and move their herds up there away from where his brother Jacob's are. So let's fast forward to chapter 37. There's a story about Dinah. We're going to kind of skip that because while it's a great story, it does not fit our birth of a nation scenario necessarily. Now I want us to really take a look at how Joseph, how his life kind of begins after his childhood, which was pretty easy and happy, and it's kind of like one of those, you're raised in a church and everything went well, and then all of a sudden things are going to go awry for him, and he's going to have a rough go of it. So let's start the story there. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. And these are the family records of Jacob. At 17 years of age, Joseph tended sheep with his brothers. The young man was working with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And he brought a bad report about them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph. Okay, now remember Isaac's name changed, or Jacob's name changed, and so it's now Israel. So you'll start to see that more and more. God, not because he changed his name, but because God changed his name. Now Israel loved Joseph more than his other sons, because Joseph was the son born to him in his old age. And he made a robe of many colors for him, all right, or a coat of many colors. If you've heard the story or seen the musical, that's what they're referring to. And when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not bring themselves to speak peaceably to him. So this Christmas, Stephanie made a handmade quilt, which she's so busy, she doesn't have time to do a lot of her sewing things that she can do, but she's actually a really amazing sewer, seamstress, whatever the term is. I'm going to totally kill that, and the women here are going to be like, you're dumb. Yes, this is true. Whatever you call that. And she made this beautiful quilt for Tara, her sister-in-law, and because she wanted to give her something one of a kind, and it really was one of a kind. It was, in fact, I should have brought a picture of it, but it was just, and put a really cool backing on it, like super soft, something that you want to, on a cold day like this, you want to go sit by the fireplace and get under this quilt and read a book, kind of a thing. Just beautiful, all the, and it had little crosses in it, but they were all like coordinated, and it was pretty neat. I'll try to post a picture if I think of it. And so then later, the conversation on the way home was, well, Mom, how come you never made me a quilt like that, and I was kind of feeling a little like, well, how come you never made, I was like, what am I going to do with a quilt, when do I ever sit, with a quilt? I'm always dying next to the fireplace, everybody else is. So anyway, but, we're all feeling like, hey, she got this really nice, and she had, worked on this thing, for several weeks leading up to Christmas, and so it was, we were having this same thing, and I was thinking, oh, this is like Joseph's coat of many colors, or robe of many colors. So his brothers saw this, and they're already a little bit, you know how it is when you're one of the younger children, and it seems like if you're an older child, it seems like the younger one always gets, things are always unfair. I was the oldest child. I was always, biased against for my sister who could do no wrong. No, I'm just kidding. Feels like that sometimes. So that's how they felt about it. And so he has this dream now. All right, we're in verse 5, and this is where things really start to get problematic. Joseph had a dream, and he told this dream to his brothers, and they hated him even more. And he said to them, Listen to this dream that I had. There we were, binding sheaves of grain in the field. This is kind of like, there we were, coloring our coloring books. And suddenly my sheaf stood up, and your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. Okay, that's like a crop term. That's kind of like an exterior, I don't know if it's wheat necessarily, but some kind of grain. It's kind of like the exterior part of that. And it says they bowed down to my sheaf, and then they kind of said to him, well, are you really going to reign over us? Are you really going to rule us? And so they hated him even more because they interpreted the dream, right away. They're like, oh, so basically you're saying you're going to rule over us, you're going to bow down to us, even though you're like the little brother, and yeah, whatever, And so they're, starting to get kind of aggravated, and probably in the back of their minds they're thinking, well, he is one of Dad's favorites, so that could happen, So they're over years of time. All right, this isn't like a 5-minute thing, but over years of time, a lot of unforgiveness and frustration is built up, and you may or may not relate to that if you had any kind of drama with your siblings growing up. So then he had another dream. We're in verse 9, and he told it to his brothers, and he said, I had another dream, and this time the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me. Okay, well, I wonder who the 11 stars are. Okay, well, 11 plus 1 equals 12. We know there's 12 of them, and he's the one, and they're the 11, okay? And they were bowing down to me. He told his father and his brothers, but his father rebuked him. What kind of dream is this that you have had, he said. Are your mother and brothers and I going to come and bow down to the ground before you? All right, so in other words, it sounds like, based on his reaction, that the sun and the moon were, his parents, all right? And so now it's not just his siblings, but now it's become, Dad's kind of like, yeah, okay, this is starting to get a little bit out of control, a little bit out of hand. And so he begins to ask this. Really? That's just not how things are. That's just, you need to respect your parents, and it's contrary to that. So his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. All right, and so I think as I'm reading a little bit commentaries, studying that, I think his father kind of knew there was something special about him, that these dreams meant something. I don't think it can sound like, without that comment, it could sound like, well, he just had these dreams and he just kind of being a pain in the butt, like little brothers or little sisters can be a pain in the I don't know if I can say butt. My wife's not here to police my words. Rear end. He's kind of a pain in the rear end, and so he kind of keeps the matter in mind, like, this sounds like more like a vision, or that the Lord is somehow doing something or speaking something, and he's not really, of course, if we heard something like that, we would think, well, that's weird, but he kept the matter in mind, so in the back of his mind, I think he's thinking, okay, there's something to that, God's doing something. And remember that even at this point, the line of Abraham through Isaac and Jacob is still faithful to God, and of course, really, even though we had 400 years between Noah and Abraham, there's only 2 generations here, or 3. Once you get to Joseph, it's not a whole lot of time. The flood isn't that distant of a memory. That's still a very much, even the other nations that are, not have chosen to kind of go their own way. I'm sure in their oral tradition, the flood is a big part of that. All right, so we're not that far away from that. So as we're reading this, keep that in the back of your mind. In verse 12, his brothers had gone to pasture their father's flocks at Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, your brothers, are pasturing the flocks at Shechem. Get ready, because I'm sending you to them. I'm ready, Joseph replied. Apparently he's the born ready variety. Not all of my children are that way. And Israel says to him, go and see how your brothers and the flocks are doing, and bring word back to me. And so he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he went to Shechem. Well, a man found him there wandering the field, and asked him, what are you looking for? He said, well, I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they're pasturing their flocks? They moved on from here, the man said. I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. So Joseph set out after his brothers and found them at Dothan. Now, one of the thoughts that I have initially as I'm thinking about this, I'm like, well, how does he not know where they're at? It's like he's on this quest to figure out where they went. But first of all, one thing you have to understand about this particular land, it's not desert, but it's pretty arid. It's not the most fertile soil either. And you're not talking about, like our herd of 7 sheep and 40 cows. You're talking thousands of animals, and they need a lot of space to migrate. So it can take them days and weeks and even months to move around, where there's grass. So this is a major operation. So he kind of knows the general direction because sure Dad told him, okay, go that way, or they know where depending on what the year is, where the grass is and what condition it's going to be in and where the water is, because of course they've always got to be close to water and or they can get into a lot of trouble. So he's on kind of this quest. It's not just walk 10 minutes across the field and go tell your brothers, this is kind of so he's on this journey to find him, and he talks to this other guy, and he says, okay, they were here and a little while ago, now they're way over here. So he's going after him. And then it says, they saw him in the distance, and before he had reached him, they plotted to kill him. All right, so his brothers are out there, they're doing their shepherding, and they see Joseph, and they're like, hey, this is our moment. We're way far away from Dad, and we're out here, and, anything could go wrong. There could be mountain lions, there can be all kinds of bad things could happen, and so let's kill him, and we'll see if we can kind of cover it up and nobody will know. In verse 19, they said to one another, here comes that dreamer. Come on, let's kill him and throw him into one of the pits. And we can say that a vicious animal ate him, and then we'll see what becomes of his dreams. All right, so obviously, unforgiveness, they're plotting to kill him. And this is, okay, just to kind of point out the obvious, this is the nation of Israel. Okay, this is the patriarchs of the people that God is going to make a great nation out of, the people that are going to follow him. So one thing I really want to draw out here is sometimes we feel like, or we observe or draw the conclusion that if we aren't perfect, God can't use us. If there's something in our life that is, wrong, well, then somehow we're just disqualified. And I feel like that a lot, so I get that. I think that's not unusual to feel that way. But God has his purposes. And while what we do can impair that, it certainly can harm it. It can make things turn out differently than what was intended. God's going to ultimately see his purposes come to fruition. And so he's going to use each of these guys, even though there are a bunch of plotting, scheming murderers and liars. He's going to use them to make a great nation. And so I want to kind of pause and let us really take that in, because none of us are exempt from God using us. And that doesn't mean that there aren't things in our life that need to be fixed. That doesn't mean there doesn't need to be repentance, and that doesn't mean we can do damage to God's purposes. But it does mean that those purposes are still there. And it's not like, we're going to come along and wreck God's plan somehow because, whatever it is. I mean, Lucifer, who obviously is a lot more powerful than we are, he could not wreck God's plans. Nobody can. God's plans are what they are. And so he is going to see that this nation is born regardless of what happens. And in fact, we're going to see that God takes the circumstances that these guys meant to do harm, and he's going to turn it around. And not only is he going to bless Joseph, they're going to be blessed. All right, we'll see how that works out. Let's keep reading. When Reuben heard this, he tried to save him from them. Okay, now Reuben was one of the older brothers, and he's he's a little bit older, a little bit less dumb. I was going to say wiser, but probably less dumb at this point. And he's thinking, you know what? Okay, I gotta do something to help Joseph out because these guys are serious, and this is going to end badly. So he said, "Let's not take his life." And Reuben also said to them, "Let's not shed blood. Throw him into this pit in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him." And then it says, intending to rescue them from their hands and return him to his father. So he's going to go back later, once they throw him in this pit, and rescue him. Okay, and then, just let the chips fall to where they lie later. The brothers are going to be ticked, but at least his brother isn't going to get killed. When Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped off his robe, the robe of many colors that he had on. They took him and they threw him into the pit. The pit was empty and there was no water in it. And they sat down to eat a meal, and they looked up, and there was a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. All right? And where did the Ishmaelites come from? Ishmael. Okay, good. Whew. I realize I kind of talked a long time. I'm losing you guys. We'll wrap it up here in a minute. All right. So they're coming through, and so the wheels are turning. We're thinking, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to sell him. Their camels were carrying aromatic gum, balsam, and resin going down to Egypt. Those are all tradable goods. All right. So it's kind of like a caravan of tradable goods. They're merchants. And then Judah said to his brothers, "What do we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood?" I'm sure Reuben's thinking, "Oh no, now my plan's going to be wrecked. This is not going to work. Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay a hand on him, for he is our brother and our own flesh." And they agreed, which I'm thinking he's saying that, but he's thinking, hey, we can do this and make some money, so this is a great idea. All of a sudden this is sounding like, oh yeah, this is definitely what we need to do. When Midianite traders passed by, his brothers pulled Joseph out of the pit and sold him for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took Joseph to Egypt. All right, so 20 pieces of silver, that was quite a bit. An ounce of silver throughout history, give or take, usually is enough to buy you some really nice clothes and provisions for about a week or two. All right, so supplies, food. Now that waxes and wanes, of course, depending on the value of silver. And then right now, silver is severely undervalued. Hi, Steffi. And so, that silver should probably be around $600 an ounce. So, that tells you that, 2 times 6, that's about $12,000. So, not too shabby. They divide that up. That's $1,000 a piece, and they get rid of their annoying brother who has dreams about them bowing down to him and such. So they're thinking this is a win-win. So he sells them for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelites, okay, which I think is somewhat ironic. So when Reuben returned to the pit and he saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. All right, which that's what you do when you get really upset. All right, and we see that for the next, 1,200, 1,300 years as kind of a thing. All right, particular to Israel. All right, when you get upset, you just tear your clothes off. All right. Fortunately, I don't get very upset very often at church, so you probably don't have anything to worry about. But if you have some Jewish friends or Hebrew friends that are like the old style, you may want to look the other way if you upset them. It's kind of like upsetting a Wookiee, actually. I'm thinking about. It was not Star Wars last week, so I've already thought to myself, I'm going to keep the Star Wars comments to a minimum. And Jeff's not here, and Gary's not here, so they love Star Wars, and they would miss that, and then they would be mad at me later, probably. So that was just one time, okay? So if you give an account, there was only one Star Wars comment. Yeah. I've never eaten a Wookiee. I have a couple cats that are really furry like Wookiees, but I haven't eaten them either. So.
Nobody else does.
It's a little fuzzy alien. Yeah. See, Robert appreciates that. Yeah. All right. So anyway, I'm not sure. Let's see. How did we get to Wookiee? Oh yeah, tearing clothes. Okay. So, when Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. All right. He was very upset. He went back to his brothers and he said, "The boy is gone. What am I going to do?" So they took Joseph's robe and they slaughtered a young goat. Okay, so not what am I going to do? I've done this terrible thing. I've sold my brother as a slave to these merchants. No. What am I going to do? Because now I'm going to be in trouble and I'm probably going to lose my birthright or some blessing, and Dad's going to be mad at me forever, and that's what he's okay. It's kind of like when you get pulled over, you're not necessarily feeling bad because you were speeding or because you parked in the wrong place. You're feeling bad because you know that the ticket's going to cost money or it's going to negatively affect your insurance. All right. So they're saying to this other, okay, let's slaughter this young goat, and we'll pick it up in verse 31. We'll dip his robe in the blood. And so they sent this robe of many colors to their father, and they said, oh, we found this. We were innocently going about our pasturing with the flocks, and I'm sure they mentioned about, how all the animals were accounted for and what a great job they were doing. But alas, we found this. Examine it, okay? Which is kind of like, I'm sure he's kind of looking at him like, okay. But, he doesn't have any reason to doubt him. So, is this your son's robe or not? So in other words, look, this is you know whose robe this is because it's one of a kind. We talked about your quilt that you made for Tara earlier. I talked about how beautiful and wonderful that it was. And so he recognized it immediately because it's one of a kind, and so he knows that it's Joseph's. It's my son's robe, he said. A vicious animal has devoured him. Joseph has been torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his clothes, put sackcloth around his waist, and he mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters tried to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. No, he said, I will go down to Sheol to my son mourning. And his father wept for him. Now, Sheol is a word that is it doesn't exactly mean hell, but it's kind of talking about that. In this particular time, now you have to remember, this is before the New Testament. This is before even, the Levitical laws and a lot of the theology that is formed from, stemming from the nation of Israel and the worship of Yahweh, the worship of God. And so there was this kind of idea of this underworld, almost like, and I hate to draw parallelisms that aren't correct, but for lack of context, if you've ever seen like a Greek or read Greek works, or you've seen a movie about Greek gods or goddesses, they kind of have this idea of the underworld, and usually there's a god of the underworld also. But the Hebrews didn't believe any of that, but they did kind of believe there was like this holding place that when you died, you kind of went there till God it all out. All right, so that's what he's talking about. He's talking about going down, and it was down under the ground somewhere, in some place, and that's where kind of the cartoons get this idea of heaven being like up in the clouds and hell being underground. It doesn't actually come from Christianity, from the New Testament. It comes from this ancient Hebrew idea of Sheol, or Hades, to use a loose comparison. So that's what that word means, and so we'll see Sheol used, we'll see Hades used later, which is a Greek reference of kind of the same thing. And then later, in the New Testament, we'll see the lake of fire, all right? So where we get a clearer picture of what hell actually is, and in fact, it's not even created until the end time. So just a little note if you're kind of wondering, like, what does Sheol mean? But from their understanding, I will go down to Sheol. In other words, I'm going to go to the underworld. I'm going to go to my death, the end of my life, in mourning. And his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and the captain of the guard. All right, so we have the story kind of diverges now in two places, and we're going to close with this. So on the one hand, we have all of the 11 brothers and their dad, who is just devastated, what's happened. And, of course, Rachel passed away. And so they're kind of left in hopelessness. And now Joseph begins this new adventure in Egypt. All right, so they've traveled further. If you were here when we looked at our map, they've kind of come down south from the north, and now they've stayed in and around Canaan. And they have sent Joseph now over to the east towards Egypt. And So that's where he is. And he has actually kind of landed himself in a really good place, although I'm sure he doesn't feel like it because he's used to being Dad's favorite and having this nice coat and dreaming all these dreams about his brothers bowing down to him. And now he's a slave, and I don't imagine whatever palace he finds himself in, it's not a good thing. So before we pray, I want to make a couple comments. First of all, Joseph's brothers meant to do him harm, and they wanted to get rid of him. Okay, there's no question about it. So if you've heard this story before, sometimes maybe if we hear it in a sermon or we don't read it in the context, which obviously it's taken us 2 months to do that, so you can't always read it in the context, coming from Noah and Abraham and understanding that whole story. But since we have, and we've taken that time to do that, we can see that this situation should have ended badly. With Joseph being a slave, and there's going to be a famine pretty soon, and pretty much their family's going to die out. That, as we talked about earlier, they live in a desert region already, and as we know, climate changes. It's in cycles, and so you'll have a cycle of cold, a cycle of hot. Obviously, we're in a little bit of a cold cycle ourselves right now, and so that's going to come, and that's how the story could have ended. The nation of Israel would have died before it ever began. But God had a plan, and even though as crazy as it is, he allowed the selfishness and the cruelty of Joseph's brothers to be the way that God delivered him. And now, I don't want to kill the ending, but I think most of us know the story. Joseph is going to find favor with the Egyptians, and in fact, he's going to become a great leader and a great ruler, second only to Pharaoh, and he is going to deliver his whole family from death, of this famine, and then they're going to become a great nation. Of course, they're going to go through another hardship later. So I want us to draw that out, because I believe that our lives happen very much like this. That we think that when we get saved and we meet God, we think to ourselves, man, this is it. All of the bad times are behind me. It's all going to be easy. There might be some bumps in the road, but everything's going to be great. I'm going to get rich. My health is going to be great. We're thinking all these things about, I'm going to be a, whatever evangelist, and thousands of people are going to hear me preach, or I'm going to, write books, or whatever it is, whatever spiritual gift you have or you feel like God's going to do. And then we walk our walk for a month, a year, 10 years maybe, and then something catastrophically bad happens. All right. Now, hopefully, looking around the room, I shouldn't probably assume this, but probably, at least what I can say with somewhat confidence, none of us have been sold by our family as slaves, where we dwelled in a foreign, strange place for the bulk of our lives. Okay, so we can safely say that. Although human trafficking and slavery is a very real thing, and it's a terrible thing, but for us in this room, we don't have a large amount of experience with that for the most part. But we've gone through tough things like that, and in this case, it was necessary. It was necessary for Joseph to go through all that. For one, his character probably did need a little bit of adjusting. Sounds like he was kind of arrogant, selfish. I want to ask, okay, why was Joseph at home, apparently not doing anything, while all of his brothers were out with flocks? Okay, so maybe a little lazy. Now maybe that was kind of Dad protecting him because he didn't want him to get eaten by a wild animal, maybe. But still a little sheltered, a little pampered, and so some character building needed to happen in his life. And so God is working all these things out. He's working Joseph's character. He's working on delivering his family. He's working on creating a great nation. So there's really three, and there's even more than that going on, but there's three major things that are happening. And I believe, and I've seen in my life and in other people's lives, that God does that same work in us. And he allows us to go, either he directly sends us or he allows us to go through these difficult things. If somebody asked me, well, do you think that it was God's plan that Joseph's brothers would try to kill him and sell him into slavery? No. I don't think so. I do see God bringing nations and people to justice, but I don't see God just out there doing bad things, wanting people to starve, wanting people to die, I think that God always intends good, but Satan always intends evil. And so because of his effect on the earth and because of sin, bad things happen. And I don't think that's necessarily God's will. Sometimes it is God's will. But every time a bad thing happens, I don't think that's necessarily because it's God's will. I think it's because there's sin and darkness in the world. And that's the natural consequence of that sin and darkness. That's why God is trying to get rid of it once and for all. That's why we celebrate Jesus' birth. But for whatever reason, all that, the theology aside, those hard times come in our lives. And maybe you are in one of those hard times right now. And maybe you're like in month 2, month 3, year 2, year 3, and you just wonder, man, when is it going to end? Well, Joseph's trial went on for years. And we're going to go through it. We're going to look at it. So you may know the story, you may not. If you don't, he's going to go through some ups and some downs. But it's going to be a long, hard road before he gets to a lot of the really high ups. All right, he's going to see a lot of low lows for a while. And that's how life can be. But all that time, God's working on him. He's working on the situation. He's working on God's epic purpose for Joseph and for all of us ultimately to bring about the nation of Israel and ultimately Jesus, the Messiah. And all that time, though, time is passing. And there's emotional pain and physical pain and hardship. But all of that has to happen. And so if you're in one of those places now and you're in one of those seasons of life and you just feel like, man, I'm going through the ringer. It is never ending. You just come through one trial. It's kind of like a lot of times if you watch TV, the writers of the shows are really good now about, you have this epic cliffhanger at the end of one season and then you think, okay, it's going to get resolved at the series premiere of the next season, and it does, only for this whole other thing to happen. All right, so like on this one post-apocalyptic show I'm watching, 2 seasons ago, they were fighting against this other clan, trying to survive. Well, they finally got that resolved, only to find out that all the remaining nuclear plants that had kind of withheld the radiation, the safeties were failing, and so this huge another thing of radiation was going to come wipe them all out. All right, so that's like every show probably that you've ever watched that's in that genre, and so that seems like that happens in our lives too. We just get through some major financial challenge or some major health challenge or something with our kids. Maybe you get your kids raised and you're thinking, man, right now I have to say there's times in my life where I think if I can just get my kids raised and I can see them be successful young men and women and adults, I'm just going to cruise into retirement bliss and happiness. And so those of you that have cruised and sailed into child raising retirement bliss realize that it's not quite as blissful as what it may have seemed because you just start a whole nother series of trials, all right? And that's life. And we have to accept that, and in fact, we have to embrace that and realize that God is working it all out. He's working His purposes out. We can fight it, or we can go, it's kind of like when, if you've ever said this to your kids, there's the easy way, and there's the hard way, And eventually you figure out, it's always better to choose the easy way, all right? That's part of becoming an adult. We realize, okay, there's a better way than, making bad choices. And so there is a way to walk with God through it, or there is just a way to be out there in the storm. It's kind of like if you walked outside tonight at about 2 in the morning, in a t-shirt and shorts, it's going to be a bad experience. It's just not going to be good. And so we can do that. It sounds ridiculous, and hopefully as I'm looking at the expressions on their faces, you're thinking, I would never do that. One, because I wouldn't want my neighbors to see me and be embarrassed by that, although if you're me, that's not necessarily a problem. Jimmy and Melissa have already seen some crazy things because they, I'm sure they're sitting over there with their binoculars, watching what crazy thing is going to happen next over there. But, usually, for the most part, you're thinking, okay, I can deal with that. But we tend to make better decisions. We tend to think, man, I'm going to stay in where it's warm, and so we ought to do that. We ought to stay with God where things are better. Even though it doesn't mean it's going to be easier necessarily, it's going to be better. And we know that God's going to walk us through. And it's just like when you go to the hospital and you've got a procedure or something's going to happen, it's always good to have somebody with you. That's why when you give birth, typically, not always, ladies like to have their husbands with them so that somebody will hold their hand just to be there for them, that there's a comfort that comes from that. And we're made to need each other, even though some of us are a little bit kind of vigilante, renegade. I can pioneer on my own, live on my own. People are just not made that way. We're made to depend on one another and to trust one another, and ultimately to trust God. And so I hope you're encouraged by that. We'll continue the story and see what happens to Joseph and see how God works that out. And the reason why we do that, I'll close with this statement. The reason why we do that is not just so we can become great historians, so that we can understand how God is working in our life, because He works the same. He always works the same way. He's consistent. He never changes. He never, breaks His promises or breaks His covenants. He works the same way, has the same goals, same purposes. He never changes. And we can draw comfort and strength from that. Let's pray. God, we thank You for Joseph and for Jacob and for all of the patriarchs of the 12 tribes of the nation of Israel that we looked at today. We thank You for their hardship and their struggles, so that we might understand who You are and know how You work and what Your purposes are for us. And Lord, I pray for those that are in this circle, which is probably the majority of us, that we're just trying to survive life. We're just trying to understand what our purpose is, what our role is, what Your plan is for us, to understand why the hardships exist in our lives, to know how to deal with them, what counsel to give others that are going through hard times, and what decisions to make ourselves. And so I pray, Lord, that You would bring us just a spirit of comfort today, knowing that no matter how difficult things get for us, those things have been being experienced by the human race for thousands of years, and will continue to be experienced until You return. So, Lord, I pray that we would draw comfort from that today, and that we would walk away encouraged, knowing that we're not alone, that You are with us, that we have each other to depend on. And I just pray, Lord, for every specific hurt, for every specific hardship that exists in this circle today, that You would just ease that burden, that You would ease that pain, that You would allow us to experience Your presence as we walk through these trials. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.